Our panelists are Chloe Haywood, Richard Erskine, and where is Sarah Queblatin, and we are still waiting for Philip Gain to join us, hopefully he'll be there soon. But before we start with the panelists, I would like to give the floor to Jos Hermans, who's the chair of COMMEET. By the way, I am the secretary of the board of COMMEET. So Jos, the floor is yours. And
thank you.
Go ahead, please.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. We are really happy to have you with us during this webinar. The COMMEET Fellowship is organizing this meeting to address one of the most urgent issues of this time, which is the care for our environment, and also how we can tackle this issue at the community level. Last month, perhaps you noticed it, last month we celebrated the 50th anniversary of the first report of the Club of Rome. It was called The Limits to the Growth. And during the last half century, this eminent forum has asked our continuous attention for the environmental future of our world. And of course, many of the policies and measures they proposed are issues on a political level. But an important factor to be considered is also to find out how we can bring the necessary policies down to the local level. And we at COMMEET Fellowship see it as our challenge to help with finding possible answers to this question, which is also a major issue of the UN SDGs, as you know. With our meetings, our publications and advice, we aim to increase awareness and to raise inspiration to get into action in neighborhoods, communities, and in regions all over the world. Well, it may be true that a lot of activities to protect our environment cannot be achieved with political efforts only. Local initiatives are really the cornerstones to achieve real success. This is why we have organized this webinar, to help you with starting local initiatives at the bottom level. And I'm very happy to present to you our secretary, Martin Schrever. Well, he introduced himself already, who will be moderating the session. He will lead you through the program. Well, I'm convinced you will be delighted to discuss and to learn how we can contribute a little to a cleaner future for this world. Thank you.
Thank you, Jos. Thank you for your interesting view on things and on leading the COMMEET Fellowship. I've had the pleasure of joining the COMMEET Fellowship for a couple of years now, but you started it before, and I think you're doing an excellent job. The board is a very pleasant place to be in and to help people with, and we've also got the strong support of our fellows, and I would like to especially mention Ross Wade here, who was in the program as one of the panelists, but she was never intended to be the panelist and is replaced by Sarah Queblatin. But Ross, thank you so much for always being ready to help us and support us and advise us. You're doing an excellent job in COMMEET, and I would like to underline that strongly here. Philip Gain has not yet arrived. No doubt he is trying desperately to link up with this webinar. I had intended him to be the first speaker of today, but since he hasn't arrived yet, we'll have to change that part of the program a bit. So if I may turn to Chloe Haywood instead. Chloe is a young person, as you can all see, much younger than the people in the board of COMMEET. And one of the questions I would like to ask her, why is youth engagement so important for climate action? Chloe, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Martin. Yeah, I think it's an important question, and I'm also not surprised again to be one of the youngest in the room in a call like this. I do think it's super important to engage young people though, in decision-making and action itself on climate change. I do think there is a real intergenerational injustice and a need for more solidarity and also collaboration between people of all ages for this sort of problem. And there is a clear interest amongst young people, I think, for the health of the planet and also a frustration. I mean, you can imagine people far younger than myself learning about these kind of issues in school, but then, you know, not being able to vote or influence their families, I don't know, transport decisions or energy decisions in quite the same way. So understandably, there is frustration, and there is, despite that, a lot of youth-led movements and individuals who've had quite an influence. But sadly, I think for young people, a large percentage of their lifetime will be mitigating or adapting to climate change. And for some people already probably is a reality that's compromising education and other things. And I think also future generations are people who, you know, technically don't already exist. So how do we represent them, and how do we bring about their voice? And young people, I guess, are the closest we have to that, and almost have kind of a stake in that, as it's their families to come. And I think it's, you know, you look at, for example, the African continent, where the average age is 19, but then the average age of leadership, for example, is 62, then, you know, you can understand how people might not resonate with politics or the actual discussions on the issue itself. I think that's really important. I think it's not just about inclusion of young people, it's actually about more kind of meaningful engagement and actual collaboration, and not having like this stigma around people being, you know, not as educated or not as experienced, because there also needs to be this shift away from a focus on scientific knowledge being on a kind of pedestal, and actually on people's hearts and minds, and engaging with people's actual feelings and what they can see and what they can hear around the issue, and not just right or wrong ways to approach it or to act.
Right, thank you. I think you're certainly right that it's absolutely necessary for young people to raise their voices, but also to join hands with the elderly people who, after all, tend to make the decisions, not only in Africa, I think. I saw in the chat box that Ian said we are all young at heart, and this is probably one of the reasons why everybody is here at the moment. So, but I have another question for you. What does it mean to have inclusive action on climate action?
Yeah, another good question. I think there's a real kind of understanding of climate change as having differential impacts on people, you know, the actual issue itself. For example, depending on where you live in the globe or how much contribution you've had to emissions, those almost least responsible will be affected the most. And there's also obviously demographic factors that will influence how much of an extent you'll be impacted by climate change, or when you'll be impacted. But we don't often think about how differential the actual action itself can have impacts on people, and how it might not be such an equal process to adapt or mitigate to climate change. And I think, you know, often, for example, adaptation, you know, who does adaptation actually benefit, if there is benefits for people, and how are the benefits distributed, and kind of who actually has an equal experience of that, and can something like adaptation be an unequal process or discriminatory and exclude certain people or even certain knowledge types? And, you know, who is actually leading adaptation or mitigation or action on climate change, and who's excluded from that leadership, or who's even excluded from participation? I think that's really important to consider, because if it's not an inclusive, you know, response to climate change, then is it really sustainable, and will it then feed into development? I'm currently doing some research on Indigenous women-led climate change adaptation, and I found it really interesting just to see how Indigenous contributions to climate change and how they're perceived, and whether it's just a process of, you know, adaptation with or for Indigenous communities, rather than actually led by or coming from the communities themselves. You know, we talk a lot about bringing in Indigenous knowledge, but can that also be quite extractive? So I think it's really important to consider if the actual action itself is inclusive, and how our responses to climate change can also be differential, and in kind of the experience of it be different between different people.
Yes, absolutely. I agree with you. And I think everybody does. It should be inclusive, and everybody should be involved, no matter whether they are poor or rich, or where they live, which part of the world they are from. I understand you also did some research in the Philippines, didn't you?
Well, this is the research I'm doing. I leave in about a month's time.
and we have somebody from the Philippines here in the panel, Sarah Quebletin, who has not been introduced on the Eventbrite page, which was a mix-up on the board side. I'm sorry for that. But Sarah is the founder and leader of the Green Relief Initiative in the Philippines. And she also is somebody who has worked tirelessly and has a lifelong interest in, if I may quote you there, in practice in restoring and restoring narratives of place belongings through ecosystem restoration and leadership. Is that correct, Sarah?
Thank you. Thanks so much for the invitation, Martin, and nice to know, Chloe, you've been working in the Philippines. Yeah, grateful to be here, and so meaningful that inclusivity is an important topic, especially that, yeah, we probably know already that many minorities, or what we could say refer to more as the global and the majority world, often the minorities and in the global south, are bearing the brunt of climate impacts much harder than the global north. But not saying that not everyone is affected. Everyone is. And it's more a matter of equitability and capacity to recover and adapt, and that we all are in the same place together. And in our work, at least, the inclusivity approach is to shift the narrative. How do we, as we say, it begins with the worldview of how we design the process of bringing people together to be consulted, or to be heard, or to be given the voice. Or to speak on behalf if it's not possible. And that it's for us, where we work with the change of narrative is to, like, for example, the process of, because right now we're in the UN Decade for Ecosystem Restoration, and we're catalyzing the aims of restoring our soils, our water, our landscapes, to address, climate, as buffers to climate disasters. But in the process, the decision makers, or the rift, or the what do you call this, the silos across stakeholders are also like a big factor. And there are many solutions already. For example, where we work with multi-stakeholder labs, and bringing these stakeholders to dialogue and deepen their relationships, but also, like, for people in high, powerful positions to be able to really engage with the most vulnerable in a deeper dialogue, rather than just inviting them to a meeting and input and then leave, or that. But it's a matter of a learning journey, or rather an unlearning journey, where we also really become human in our process, and really go beyond our roles and positions. And on another level is we work with permaculture and tech, traditional ecological knowledge, acknowledging that permaculture is, there's local knowledge on ecosystem restoration already in place, and being able to weave that in ways that a remembering of the knowledge that's already inherent in the place, and combining it with what needs to be innovated in the landscape. And in part of it, it's also how we tell the story of who takes ownership of the knowledge, and who takes also the acknowledgement of capacity as well, especially with working with the most vulnerable in the landscape. And lastly, I guess part of it is to invite and change the narrative of climate vulnerability, because at some point it's really about how vulnerability can invite us to really reflect on our role in this, it's a generation defining time. It's how what we decide today affects many multiples of generations after us, and it's really how we reframe how we think, and that invitation to be vulnerable, where everyone probably in your part of the world, you're feeling the heat already, and us in our part of the world, we're preparing for the next super typhoon. That how can we use this vulnerability to deepen this understanding of ourselves and our role, and how finite our time is, and our I guess the resources are at the same time, and using this time to transform, to restore the things that we've lost, we remember them. To restore is how to change the narrative of the future we want. So I guess that's basically what I could share, and inclusivity and other things. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I have a question for you, because I understand you operate very much on the grassroots level, don't you? Which is totally in line with the COMMEET approach of community empowerment, because we think that communities can only change if they change themselves, rather than being told from above how to change. Can you say anything more about that? How you do this? Because I'm sure we can learn from you. We would love to learn from you.
Thanks. I wouldn't say we're experts at it. They're also learning. One thing a powerful story I carry is we work with an indigenous community affected by the typhoons. We had some learnings about really trusting the locals know what is best. We had a donation which has a really limited resource, and we had to donate to this number of families. But we also realized we can't give everybody the same equal amount, because some families have more, some families have less. And so we thought, from a justice lens, let's give those with more kids more, those with less kids less. And we tried to deviate from, what the committee said, we're indigenous community, we thought that having equal that they wanted was not fair for the others. And when we did the feedbacking, we learned that they said, with our indigenous values, we want everyone to have everything and to feel that they have been included. And what would happen is, when they feel that, they would start giving to others, those who need it more. So for us, that was so defining. So for me, I would say, I feel like the best practice is to continue listening and then learning as a practitioner. And we try as much as we can, try to inspire them to tell their own story. And which is a bit hard with the pandemic, because when we started facilitating videos that they could tell their story and be the teachers for the permaculture training in disasters. But we're getting there, that they would be the ones to lead. We are trying to see that their learnings as survivors of disasters actually should be the core knowledge or practice of any materials we develop, because who are we designing for and who are we designing with are important. And so that's basically our principle. I think those who've survived are the best people to guide us. Yeah, I guess that's how we would approach it.
Yes, and in a vulnerable part of the world like the Philippines, I think this is absolutely necessary. And you see the same approach, I think, slowly happening elsewhere in the world. I read a story about indigenous people in Australia who have an age-old method of containing forest fires by apparently burning parts of the forest before the real fire breaks out, so that it can't spread if the fire does break out. And I think we can all learn a lot from this kind of ancient methods that people have used for so long, that have been ignored to a large extent, at least in the Western world, I think. So thank you very much for your contribution. Maybe people have questions afterwards when we've gone through the round of the contributions by the panelists. I would have loved to introduce Philip Gain to you from Bangladesh. In our preparatory meeting, he had some very insightful remarks on the situation in Bangladesh, which is suffering on the one hand from deforestation a lot, because in Bangladesh forests are being cut down to a very, very large extent. And on the other hand, one of the things that is caused by climate change is the heavy toll they pay on inundations, on floodings, and the two are also interconnected. But there's not much more that I can say about that, other than that the government has promised to do something about it, but they're all waiting for the government to actually carry out their promises. And I would have liked to ask Philip about how communities in Bangladesh can do something about this, but perhaps with the toolkit that has been developed by Richard Erskine and Katie Dick and a couple of other people, maybe they can this toolkit can help communities in Bangladesh to move forward and tackle climate action. And Richard, I understand that you will be the one who's going to present the toolkits that you've been developing. Is that right?
Yes.
So if you are prepared to do that right now, I'll be happy to give the floor to you.
Okay. Thank you. Sorry about being the only one doing a presentation, but it just felt it was easier because can you see that?
Yes, we can.
Yeah. Partly because I think that when people hear the words toolkit for climate change, probably if you ask 100 people, you get 100 different answers. So it seemed that it was, we just needed to clarify, where we are. And there's a lot of people to thank, which I don't have time for, but we have an international group of participants. We have people from Nigeria, from Belarus, United States, and so forth, who have been very helpful in providing input, one-to-one interviews, as well as group sessions, and then feedback on written material and so forth. And so we feel as though we're pretty close to having, if you like, the text, but it has to then go through a process of, sub-editing, and then the adding the kind of making it sing bit, which is the graphic design and all that stuff. But we're pretty close to the text, I think, now. So, I mean, the project aims, I think, resonate with the sentiments that people have been expressing. This is very much aimed at trying to provide methods and tools to help groups form, community groups, or existing groups to kind of reinvigorate themselves, and to provide some processes and some approaches that will help them. And recognizing, I think, some of the things that were being, I think Chloe mentioned earlier, some people will always see climate change through a technological lens. They want to talk about PV and stuff. Other people will want to talk about ecology. Other people will want to see things through the arts or through a very political lens, or and you can add many different frames which overlap and interact. And in a sense, there's no right lens to look at it. It's really a question of trying to embrace those and to try and make sense through that diversity. And although it's community-led, very much our systems thinking approach, which is why I guess Schumacher got involved here, is to recognize that there are many different levels that we can work at. There is the country, there's the international, there's the individual, there's the local politics, there's business, there's the household, and really start to think about how those connect. What we've not done or attempted to do is produce the kind of million-page how to do a solar project or how to do a permaculture project, because there's lots of material out there. In fact, there's lots of that kind of stuff around, but perhaps there's less of what we think this niche it fills, which is really helping groups to understand where they want to go. And so on the principles, this idea of universality, so that it would work in, where I was born, which is in Somaliland, or or where I am now, which is in the Cotswolds, or in the Philippines. So this idea of universality is really important to us. And combining the heart, head, and hand. Obviously, some people will approach climate change with very much an intellectual approach. Others, very much, if you like, through practical hands-based things. And obviously, the heart must not be forgotten either. The hopes, fears, anxieties, etc., that need to be resolved. And again, there's no right and wrong about any of those. And we think that actually also that a group will evolve. It's not a question of writing terms of reference and saying, right, it's done, It's a learning process. It's continually learning. There's no, in a sense, no endpoint to this. There's no final, we've now finally got the blueprint. And what we're certainly not doing is saying, here's a blueprint. No, it's an approach which help you will develop your projects and ideas. So systems thinking, well, it's a huge topic, and there's people on this call that know more about it than I will ever know. But suffice to say that for this toolkit, we're wanting to actually boil it down to some very simple practices, if you like. The practice of seeing connections between things, trying to look for root causes, and those kinds of things, not splitting things into silos. An example I really like often to give is, you know, if you're looking at school and you're thinking about pollution outside the school, you could do that just in terms of technology and say, well, people need to be driving EVs rather than petrol cars. But what about health? What about thinking about places where children can shelter when it's too hot because there's no shading? You know, you could actually say that ecology, transport, health, these three different themes could all come together in a very creative way to think about how you might have that conversation. And it's too easy to break things into silos. So we want to smash the silos as well. Context is always important. So what is right in Hargeisa will not necessarily be the right conversation to be having in where I'm living now. I think that's very, very important. And to provide a kind of framework for the group, this is sort of borrowed. Picasso said, good artists borrow, great artists steal. Well, I hope I'm being at least a good artist here, in the sense of borrowing this from the Design Council's double diamond approach to problem solving. I think with a lot of groups, what I've observed is you'll have some strong voices who will jump to the answer. We must do this project. And 5 years later, they've done that project. Everyone's exhausted, but a lot of people haven't had a chance to express themselves. And so with this approach, it's very much after you've formed a group, worked out what your values are and those sorts of things, is have a very divergent conversation about all the issues that might be on the table, and no ideas should be off the table. And then say, okay, for the next 6 months, we can't do all of these things, or the next year, we need to focus in on that school project, or that school issue, that pollution outside the school. And we're going to make that the focus for the next 6 months to a year. Okay, but what are all the projects we could do? We could do air sampling, we could talk, we could have an event at the school, we could have a public meeting. There's 100 things we could do just on that one issue. So again, put those all down on the table and go through a process of trying to work out which of those is going to be the focus for the next 6 months or a year. And it might be that you decide, oh, we are going to do some monitoring, but we're also going to have a climate cafe about transport and mobility, etc. And then you have your success, you do your 2-minute videos, you celebrate success, you share success, and then you go back round the loop again and perhaps pick up on some of those ideas that you had to park before. So this is just a very simple model of trying to get everyone's voices heard, whether it's in recognizing what the issues are, and the issues may not be the obvious ones. So the transport one may be a completely unfair system where people who need transport are not getting decent public transport. So the discussion of EVs might be quite exclusionary from their point of view. So this is where we need to take time and to reflect to get those sorts of discussions out. And then what is a tool? A tool is anything that's repeatable. It could be everything from simple things like postcards from the future. It could be rich picture mapping, or whatever we want to call it. It could be mapping one's environment. We could be doing climate cafes. They don't necessarily have to be very technical. In fact, in order to make this widely usable, or anywhere in the world, we really want them to be fairly low tech in that sense. and we have about 25 tools at the moment, and some of them will help at different stages in that process I showed you, in that framework. And that's it. So a big thank you. I mean, there's a number of people on the call that need to be thanked as well. So in terms of COMMEET and Schumacher on the leadership team, and Chloe and so forth, in addition to the international team. So, and of course, Katie, who's on the call, who's co-editing this with me. So that's it. Hopefully I haven't run over. Okay.
Right, thank you very much. Thank you, Richard. This was a very, very insightful presentation on what you've done with the development of the toolkits. We at COMMEET, we are very, very grateful to you and to Katie and all the other people in your team, and to the Schumacher Institute for making this possible. I've had the privilege of reading through the toolkit, and the comment of the COMMEET board will come to you very, very soon, today or tomorrow. And what I've said, I am so happy with what you've done. For instance, the story you've told us, or you've written down on Carbon Town, on the situation with the school and things. That kind of story is instrumental, I think, in convincing people that climate action is more than just looking at the government and waiting for the government to do something. You can do so much at a local level, and there's so many different actions you can take to improve the situation in your direct neighborhood. So I think you've done a wonderful job, and also the part in which you explain how groups may work and how they may develop has been very, very well done. It's something that future COMMEET Toolkits can certainly borrow from, if you allow us, obviously. So thank you very much for this, and we are extremely happy with the result. There will be some detailed comments coming your way later on, but we're looking forward to the final publication of the toolkit, which hopefully will take place in the early autumn of this year.
Yeah, I mean, on time scale, we've got a steering group meeting, and Ross, who's with a COMMEET hat on, is on that, and so we've got that in very early in August. So we need to discuss the kind of if you like, the kind of adding that little wow factor in terms of visuals and so forth. So I've got some proposals coming forward on that and how we might do that with some very talented things. So that's sort of let's park that for the moment. But just to let you know that I think we can add another oomph to it, if you like, in addition to the words, if you like.
Yeah, well, I think the words themselves already do a very, very good job in telling the message to the reader. Pictures always help, obviously, and make it more lively and more attractive. But I think the text itself has been very, very well written. It's very attractive text. It's easy to understand for many people, and yeah, we can't wait until the final result is there. So yeah, thank you very much for this. And for your information, perhaps we're also thinking about making all the toolkits available in a different way than just pieces of paper or little booklets of paper, because elsewhere in the world, people very often use their phones to get information. Many people across the world have smartphones, so if we can find a way to make toolkits available to them through the use of smartphones, an app, for instance, that would be very, very useful, I think. So this is certainly not, once the toolkit is finished, is certainly not the last time I think we discussed things with you. But anyway.
Yeah, okay. Thank you. Thank you for your kind words. Thank you.
You're very welcome. I think it's time to go to the chat box and see whether there's any question there that needs answering. I haven't been able to read through all the questions myself during the presentations. Ross, is there any question you think needs to be answered?
Yes, there's a few questions, Martin. Thank you for asking. Firstly, about the involvement of young people in particular. There's a question from myself and another question from Edith about how do we best show solidarity and support to young people who are increasingly taking the lead in climate action? And how do we bring them to full realization of the impact of climate change through education, perhaps? This is from Edith, the second one. And how do we bring them to the table for these discussions on climate change? That's back to Chloe in particular, but other panelists may have comments about that too.
Yeah, I don't mind going first. Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question, and one also I've thought about as well. It's hard to answer. I think COVID and also climate change are both kind of issues that affected everybody in a very different way, that people have had to come together in, you know, rooms with people they wouldn't normally be in a room with, or at least discussing these sort of things. And it is really challenging, and it's hard to not, I think often it's about participation and I would say kind of box ticking of, okay, we need to have these people in this room, or we need to make sure we include these people. And sometimes that can be a bit superficial, or it can be a little bit false. And it's stepping away from that and finding new ways of working in different times and ways that actually fully engage with people. I know during COVID, at least, I helped with the startup of a local climate action group, and it was really based off kind of local councils, which typically are people of an older age. So it had a very set way of working and not much room to change. And it was unfortunate, really, because I felt I had things I could add or wanted to be there, but actually just was quite difficult and quite patronizing at times, I think. And people were quite focused on what they knew and what they'd done before, and not open to anything new, which is a real shame. So I think it is very hard, but I think the most important thing is recognizing that people have similar frustrations or motivations, particularly on a local level when you're in the same place. It's just finding new and different ways of working. And that's for all age groups, not necessarily a right or a wrong, or not necessarily that things have to change. It's just finding a kind of in the middle. And I think moving beyond stigmas or stereotypes from all age groups, you know, that particularly with young people, there's the association that things have to be digital, and actually a lot of people that's not accessible to. So it's really just moving beyond what we think we know and seeing actually what can we all bring together, and what do we all have in common. I think that's the most important thing.
Thank you, Chloe. And I think that relates directly actually to the toolkit, to be honest, because I think the whole aim of the toolkit is to break down these traditional, if you like, set in way barriers and open things out for all elements of the community. And I think that is why it is quite a revolutionary approach in a way, because I understand your point, particularly about structures that are there already when people are in power in a local council, for example, and don't want to, or maybe they don't even do it intentionally, but they don't allow other people in.
I think if you've always been working in a set way, be it, you know, a political system or the economy or anything, you have something, a curveball like climate change or, you know, COVID, for example, and it challenges that way of working. It's often associated with the new people coming in to tackle it, that they're the ones challenging it. And actually, I think sometimes it's just, it's a system that kind of needs to change with the times that are changing.
Does any of the other panelists want to comment? Sorry, Martin.
Yeah, I see Glenn has raised his hand, his electronic hand, that is. So Glenn, would you like to comment or on what Chloe just said, or is it something else that you have in mind?
Hello, everybody. It's sort of linked to what Chloe said and to the question that Ros raised about, you know, how do we engage people? And I just put this in as something that I came across quite recently, an article. It's actually written by two American bioethicists who have been working in the health sector for many years. They're both now in their 70s and become very much aware of the enormous sort of crisis that we're entering, the ecological and climate crisis coming together. And it's quite an interesting take on it in the sense that they've come up with 6 maxims of how to, what people might do in terms of engagement with this. And so I'll put the title and the authors in the chat in a moment. But the 6 maxims are, first of all, work hard to understand the immensity of what we're facing. Cultivate radical hope. I won't go into explaining what all these mean, but third one is have a line in the sand, know what you will do and what you think you won't do about these things. Appreciate the astonishing and unique opportunity, trying to put a positive spin on, and I think that might be debatable, but there's enormous change coming, and change is always an opportunity of some sort. Train your body and your mind in relation to what's happening, and act for future generations of all species, because we obviously, as one species, we are totally dependent on all other species. So the paper is called something like Ethical Maxims for a Marginally Inhabitable World, or something like that, and it's by Schenk and Churchill, and I'll put that reference in the chat. Just a thought.
Thank you, Glenn. This is very helpful, I think, and if we can all see this in detail by what you're putting in the chat, then that will be interesting to all of us, I think. Is there any other person in the panel who would like to comment on what we've just heard and what Chloe said? If not, Richard, yes, please.
Yeah, I put something in chat. I mean, for me, digital is sometimes unavoidable, but wherever possible, I think, face-to-face is the quality of conversation increases by an order of magnitude in my experience, because you can engage, at all levels. We all know body language and everything else and all that kind of stuff. We all know that communication is a lot easier face-to-face. And I think we just need to be brave and to find ways to reach a wide range, all ages, whether it's quite conservative groups or children. So, for example, I've been trying to invite myself into schools, and I've been having some success. And just a couple of weeks ago, I was in a school which is and with 12-year-olds, and I wasn't doing the dystopian thing of we're all going to die. I actually approve of that, but I was saying we are in a serious problem, and just things like discussing Oxfam's extreme carbon inequality graphic, which I like to draw, led to a really interesting conversation. And these were 12-year-olds coming up with things that I haven't heard any of the politicians that are supposed to be our leaders saying. So I think we can engage. We just got to find ways to do that through, and it can be churches, it can be Rotary. We ought to be going into places that may be outside our comfort zone, and trying to have those conversations without necessarily claiming to have all the answers.
I absolutely agree with you. We should have plenty of conversations, and face-to-face conversations and group conversations are much, much better than electronic conversations, as we've all experienced, I'm sure. Yeah, let's try and do this as much as possible, and try and engage politicians ourselves, because I'm not sure, but from the people that I know in this webinar, nobody is a politician. So let's engage with them, and then let's make ourselves heard, including the young people, obviously, and very young people, the children of the age group that you saw, very often make surprising remarks that, as you say, nobody's heard before. So yeah, thank you. Ross, is there any other question that you think needs answering?
Some questions to Sarah about her concept of unlearning. I think it was really interesting, and I wondered if she could expand a bit on that, because I think it's a really important idea.
Thank you, Ross, and yeah, for bringing it up. Well, it's more from on multiple levels as a designer of, you know, of the stakeholder journeys and also trainings, and I guess more as a practitioner, I start with that and how I'm open to unlearning. Like, I'm not here to share something that is probably new, but rather come in as what's already being done. And that's what's in context, as you know, what was presented earlier, to be context based. What's really already understood here, what their situation is. And also when we engage in the process of designing projects or collaborations, we go through this discovery journey with partners and a dialogue and interviews and really understanding. We use some tools like CREU, or we use some tools on like Filipino systems thinking and sensing to use our, like, we have this research method called pamumuno and pakikiramdam, sorry, it's sense making. And actually there is a Filipino sense making research process where it's really using our psychology or kapwa psychology of the shared self, but you're a participant, but you're not separate. And then you're still like kind of intuitive and listening. And so in that process, we're also learning like, okay, here I'm a witness, and I'm also, because I'm here to understand. And I'm here, then I design after with the people here, but it's more of us coming in as, you know, but it's same to creating a spaces for action reflection. So when we go in the field or we design a project and then we come back like, okay, did we have any gaps, or did we have blind spots here? Especially in our work, because it's a bit rapid sometimes when in a flood zone or disaster zone, we don't come in the response and rescue because that's not our field. But even if in the relief and recovery stages, it's still very confusing and disorienting because the system is broken and like every man for himself at the same time. So you have to really have some tools for sensing a lot, like, okay, what's emerging and what's changing, and anything you do now can change tomorrow. And then again, that's in a bigger story. I think that's what we're all facing now, right? It's a time of disruption. Like, we're really dealing with complexity that we're really not sure what's going to happen tomorrow. You'll have, you might have war, or you might have, and I guess that's a place of coming from curiosity in our work, and that bringing it back to our own leadership, and how am I responding to this? How am I seeing this? And in that space, what am I unlearning and what am I learning? Yeah. I don't know if I don't have a formal research process to it, so I'm not an academic researcher, but it's just constantly asking myself, I guess. Yeah. Richard is asking a question. Do you want me to answer that question, or I don't want to take up space so much? I can type it.
Ross, is there another question that Sarah can answer, please?
There is another question from Richard. Yes. How can the West learn from those in the global South already grappling with climate change, essentially? And he says, I think it's dawning on people that the impacts are not confined to those in the global South. Well, it should be dawning on us by now. And yet we have in many cases lost the community cohesion to respond effectively.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for us, I think, because I've been in both formal and informal places. So I've spoken at the climate talks, 5 COPs, and I've also, in a way, been in informal like consultations. Like tomorrow we have a consultation on an island where it was affected by typhoon, and we're bringing in the mayor, the local businesses and NGOs and the academe. I would say, I guess it's creating the container for that deep dialogue. And I would say it wouldn't be just you learning from us, but rather there's a learning. another lens that I'm really trying to see how to ethically and trauma-informed way process is, how can we look at this on a lens of reparation? Not in the sense, of course, the UK didn't really do anything much to the Philippines, but just more for, because we have the, of course, there's the restorative justice movement that is really transitional justice movement. It's looking at the wrongs of the past and colonialism. But I guess that new colonialism is also about how much carbon consumption is being consumed in the North and the South, and compared to the South, and how can these deep dialogues can help us look into, not, you don't have to apologize. So they're just really more of like whatever shift happens in the North or the high consuming carbon societies. I'm not just referring to the West, but there's also China. There's also, you know, countries like, you know, big countries in this part of the world that are high consuming, but rather just, yeah, I guess deep dialogue containers where we can be vulnerable together and really see our role, you know, as, and what kind of leadership is calling us. Right now, I think I've seen, like, we've seen so much methodologies and solutions and frameworks. I think where we are now, I think there's something that maybe we haven't done probably because we're still here. And how do we, you know, maybe we were to strip down, we're the unearthing, you know, like I'd like to think the uprooting of trees, because I always thought, like, okay, the deeper the trees, the more indigenous wisdom, the stronger the roots. But now our trees are starting to get uprooted. You know, it's a symbol of, like, there's something here that we must uproot, something from the core. No longer, like, there's something there that we have to, I don't know, sorry, I'm not very clear because it's almost midnight, but yeah. I hope that was helpful. Thanks.
Thank you.
Richard, would you like to comment?
I'm trying to reflect on it and absorb it. I'm not sure I can, you know, it's a very interesting perspective, and I'm not sure I fully understand everything you said because there's a lot of depth in there. But I do feel that there is this mutuality you're talking about. It's not just a transaction of we've done this and we've done that. It's about really recognizing some of the mutuality, but around, you know, you mentioned reparations and so forth, and trying to get people to recognize that is quite a challenge. I think we have a huge challenge in you know, countries like UK to get people to recognize that this isn't a them and us situation. We're all in this together, and we've got to work together on the solutions, which have to be global eventually.
Yeah. I absolutely agree with you. This is a global issue that affects everybody in the world. So we should all work together and try to learn from each other. Time is nearly up, so perhaps we have time for one last very short question or very short answer to a question. Ross, is there such a question that you think can be answered quickly?
Just trying to look. Just a minute. There's a question from Jeneth. It's not maybe short, but maybe we can just confine ourselves to short answers at this point because we're running out of time. Is there a benefit in communities linking with others around climate action and resilience? Can communities help to engender the international understanding that we need to make climate cooperation work? That's for any of the panelists, yeah.
Yeah, I think partly this question has already been answered because this is something that we all need to do together. So if there's anybody in the panel who would like to comment on this, that is fine with me, but otherwise I think we have to round up before Dean throws
just a quick thing. I mean, like in Stroud District, we have a network of climate action networks. So a network of networks, if you like. but I do wonder whether there might be something to be said for almost a kind of twinning. We could find ways to reach across the oceans. That's just an idea that came into my head, but it's just, I think we do need just to look elsewhere. So we think local, act local, but think global, as the old saying goes.
Yes, right. Thank you.
Also, can I just add quickly, Sarah's just mentioned on the chat that they're launching a learning journey between the UK and the Philippines using art and climate storytelling on Friday, and she's put a link in there to link into that for us to get into that and join it if we wish. Thank you, Sarah.
Well, if I can round off this webinar, then thank you all for being here. Thank you, panelists, for your contributions and for answering the questions. If anybody has any questions, or if anybody wants to get in touch with anybody else, then we can try to do that through COMMEET. The email address that you can use for that is info@commeet.org. So that's easy to remember, I think. So if you need to get into touch with anybody, with one of the panelists, for instance, please don't hesitate, approach us and we'll try and do our best to connect you up. So once again, thank you for being here. Thank you for joining this webinar. I think we've all learned a lot, and we see the importance, the global importance of fighting climate change as much as we can. So with those words, I would like to end this. So goodbye to all of you. Good luck with your work, and hope to see you again.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.